Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug so respectable that Victorian mothers gave it to screaming babies, the British Empire went to war twice to keep dealing it, and doctors prescribed it for everything from toothaches to the general condition of being alive in the 1800s. We're discussing opium, humanity's 3,000-year-old mistake that we keep making with increasing confidence. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these slow, absurd tales. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because this one starts with a beautiful flower and ends in smoke. Opium doesn't look dangerous. If you stumbled across a poppy field without context, you'd think you'd wandered into an impressionist painting that had somehow become three-dimensional. The flowers are absurdly beautiful. Delicate petals and colours that range from innocent white to blushing pink to a red so deep it looks like sunset melted into botanical form. They sway in the breeze with a kind of carefree grace that makes you want to write poetry, paint watercolours, or at minimum take an Instagram photo and caption it something about nature's beauty. They look, in other words, exactly like the kind of flower that definitely won't destroy your life if you get too friendly with it. And then you cut the bulb, when a poppy seed pod is sliced at just the right angle, not too deep, not too shallow, with a kind of precision that suggests someone spent a lot of time figuring this out. It weeps. A milky white sap oozes out like the plant is crying latex tears, which is both poetic and deeply suspicious. Leave that sap sitting in the sun for a few hours and it darkens, thickens, transforms into a sticky brown resin that smells faintly sweet and vaguely earthy, like if incense and soil had a baby. That resin is opium, and for most of human history, it was considered a gift from the gods, not metaphorically, literally. The Sumerians, who were busy inventing, writing, mathematics and organised agriculture around 3400 BCE, called it hulgil. This translates directly to joy plant, not useful medicine plant or effective painkiller plant or maybe use this carefully plant. Joy. They knew exactly what they had, and they were not being subtle about it. The Sumerians were the first people we have written records of cultivating poppies with agricultural dedication, planting them in rows alongside their wheat and barley like this was a completely normal crop to grow. Which, to be fair, it kind of was. This was an era before aspirin, before antibiotics, before literally any effective medicine except for hope you feel better and have you tried not being sick? If you had something that actually stopped pain, you grew it. You grew a lot of it. You treated it like the miracle it was. Because here's the thing about opium that everyone discovered very quickly. It works. Not in a vague placebo, maybe I feel slightly better kind of way. It works in a holy gods, the pain is just gone kind of way. You eat a little bit of that sticky brown resin, and within 20 minutes, pain disappears. Hunger vanishes. Anxiety evaporates. The part of your brain that's been screaming about everything wrong with your existence goes quiet. You're left with a warm, floating sensation that feels suspiciously like being hugged by the concept of contentment itself. For someone in genuine agony. And remember, this is an era where dental care meant hopefully it falls out before the infection kills you. This was nothing short of miraculous. It was proof that the gods, despite all evidence to the contrary, actually did care whether you suffered. The ancient Egyptians absolutely loved opium. Medical papyri from around 1500 BCE, which are basically the world's oldest surviving medical textbooks written on fancy paper made from reeds, list opium as a remedy for approximately everything. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the most complete medical documents from ancient Egypt, is 110 pages of medical advice, and opium appears repeatedly. Headache, Opium, stomach pain. Opium, crying children keeping you awake. Opium, your crops failed and you're having an existential crisis about whether the gods are punishing you. Probably also opium, though the papyrus is less specific on that one. That bit about crying children is both brilliant and deeply alarming depending on your perspective on dosing toddlers with narcotics. Egyptian mothers would give small amounts of opium to babies who wouldn't stop crying, and the babies would, unsurprisingly, stop crying. They'd also stop doing pretty much everything else, including moving, which from a parenting perspective is either the greatest hack ever discovered or child endangerment with a very long historical precedent. The Egyptians did not see a problem with this. They saw a solution. A very quiet, very still solution. The Greeks inherited opium from their neighbours and, being Greeks, immediately started philosophizing about it while also using it extensively. They called it opium, meaning poppy juice, because ancient Greeks were refreshingly literal about naming things. No poetry, no mysticism, just, here's some juice from a plant. Hippocrates, the father of medicine and the guy doctors still swear oaths to, despite him having been dead for 2400 years, prescribed opium regularly. He recommended it for pain, obviously, but also for internal diseases, epidemics, and women's diseases, which was Greek medical terminology for, I don't know what's wrong, but this will make them feel better. Hippocrates wasn't some fringe medical quack recommending crystals and positive thinking. He was the medical authority of the ancient world. His endorsement meant opium was legitimate medicine, respectable, the kind of thing serious physicians used on serious patients. And it worked. If you've ever had surgery and woken up feeling pleasantly disconnected from your body, congratulations. You've experienced what ancient Greeks were dealing with, except they were doing it with raw plant resin instead of FDA-approved pharmaceuticals administered by people who wash their hands first. But here's what's important to understand about why opium is so effective. It doesn't just treat pain, it fundamentally rewrites how your brain processes suffering. Your brain has these things called opioid receptors scattered throughout your nervous system, in your brain, your spinal cord, your gut, basically everywhere that might need to register something is wrong. These receptors are like molecular locks, and your brain produces its own keys in the form of endorphins, those natural feel-good chemicals you get from exercise or eating chocolate or hugging a dog. When you take opium, you're not getting a gentle, natural endorphin boost. You're flooding your system with external opioids that are stronger, more direct and more overwhelming than anything your brain would produce on its own. These external opioids click into those receptor locks, and suddenly everything softens. Pain becomes distant, like something happening to someone else. Fear becomes irrelevant. The part of your brain that's constantly scanning for danger, the part that evolved to keep you alive by making you worry about saber-toothed tigers, gets gently shushed into blissful silence. For someone in agonizing pain, this is a miracle. For someone who just wants to feel okay for a few hours, this is a trap disguised as a warm blanket. The Romans knew all of this. Well, not the neurochemistry part. They hadn't discovered receptors yet, but they knew opium was powerful, effective, and had some concerning side effects if you paid attention. They used it extensively, especially for soldiers, gladiators, and anyone else whose job description included getting stabbed on a regular basis. The physician Galen, who served multiple Roman emperors and wrote extensively about basically everything, dedicated significant attention to opium in his medical texts. He listed its benefits: stops pain, aids sleep, treats coughs, calms the stomach. Then he noted, almost as an afterthought, that people who used it regularly seemed to need more and more of it to achieve the same effects. He didn't call it addiction. That word wouldn't exist in its modern medical sense for another 1800 years. He just observed that opium had a way of making people very, very attached to it. Some patients who took it for months or years couldn't seem to stop. If they tried, they felt terrible, sweating, shaking, anxious, convinced they were dying. Galen attributed this to the original illness returning, which was technically wrong, but understandable given that no one had figured out the concept of physical dependence yet. The most famous Roman opium user was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, the guy who wrote Meditations, which is still quoted by productivity gurus and stoicism enthusiasts who definitely don't know he was writing it while medicated. Marcus Aurelius reportedly used opium daily, prepared in a mixture called theriac, which was ancient Rome's version of an energy drink, except instead of caffeine and questionable vitamins, it contained opium, viper flesh, and approximately 60 other ingredients that sound like they came from a medieval witch's shopping list. His physician prepared it for him to treat stomach pain, insomnia, and what we'd probably now recognise as depression and anxiety brought on by the mild stress of running an empire that was constantly being invaded. Whether his famous philosophical clarity and stoic wisdom came from disciplined thinking or from being gently sedated for most of his reign is a question historians politely avoid asking, but it's a legitimate question. Was he wise, or was he high? The answer, frustratingly, might be both. But here's what's crucial about this entire ancient period. Opium remained relatively contained. It was medicine, not recreation. It was expensive, difficult to transport, and required at least some knowledge to use without killing yourself. You couldn't just wander into a market and buy a bag of joy plant resin without someone asking what you needed it for and whether you knew what you were doing. It existed in a careful balance. Powerful, respected, and quietly dangerous in ways people were only beginning to notice. That balance would last for over 1,000 years, carried through the fall of Rome and into the medieval period, where it would be carefully preserved by physicians who understood they were working with something precious and potentially deadly. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, opium had become one of those substances that travelled along trade routes like rumours, spreading slowly but persistently across the known world. While Europe was having what historians generously describe as a difficult period, featuring plagues, constant warfare, and a general sense that maybe civilization had been a mistake, the Islamic world was experiencing a golden age of scholarship, science, and medicine. Arab physicians were busy preserving and expanding on Greek and Roman medical knowledge, translating ancient texts, conducting experiments, and writing new treatises that would eventually teach Europe everything it had forgotten during its several-century-long collective breakdown. These physicians wrote extensively about opium. They refined it, mixed it with other substances, created compounds that were remarkably effective for their time, and documented their results with the kind of careful precision that suggests they understood they were working with something powerful. Avicenna, the Persian polymath whose full name was a paragraph long, and whose accomplishments could fill a library, wrote the Canon of Medicine around 1025 CE. This book became one of the most influential medical texts in human history, used in European universities well into the 1600s. In it, Avicenna dedicated significant space to opium. He described it as one of the most powerful drugs available, capable of treating pain, diarrhea, coughs that wouldn't quit, and various eye diseases that sound genuinely horrifying in his descriptions. He provided detailed instructions for preparation, dosage, and administration. And then, in careful clinical language that suggests he'd seen this pattern repeatedly, he warned that extended use led to something he called habituation. This was one of the first clear medical descriptions of physical dependence written almost 1,000 years ago. Avicenna noted that people who took opium regularly seemed to lose their ability to feel normal without it. Their bodies adjusted to its presence. They needed it not to feel good, but to avoid feeling terrible. if they stopped taking it abruptly, they experienced what he described as a kind of illness, pain, agitation, an overwhelming compulsion to resume taking the drug. He was describing withdrawal and addiction with remarkable accuracy, centuries before anyone had the vocabulary or framework to fully understand what was happening. And his warning was largely ignored for the next 800 years, which is a pretty solid track record for humanity's ability to disregard medical advice that interferes with making money or feeling better. Medieval Europe got its opium through those same trade routes, which meant it was expensive and mostly reserved for the wealthy and the desperately ill. But it was there, tucked into apothecary shops, prescribed by physicians who'd read the translated Arabic texts, used in monasteries where monks dedicated themselves to both prayer and the practical medical care of their communities. Those monks, paragons of religious discipline and spiritual devotion, reportedly used opium-laced preparations to help with everything from toothaches to insomnia to the general malaise that comes from living in a cold stone building, eating the same bland food every day and praying 8 times a day starting at 4 a.m. Was this medically necessary or spiritually questionable? The monks didn't spend much time agonizing over it. They had enough to agonize over already. One popular medieval remedy was called dwale, which sounds like it should be a friendly character in a children's book, but was actually an anaesthetic mixture containing opium, hemlock, bryony, vinegar, and pig or sheep bile. This combination sounds less like medicine and more like ingredients for a curse, but medieval surgeons swore by it. They used it before amputations, which in the Middle Ages were performed with a kind of enthusiastic speed usually reserved for chopping vegetables, because the faster you removed the limb, the less time the patient had to die from shock. If you were getting your leg sawed off by a man in a leather apron whose last formal hygiene training had been try not to sneeze directly on the wound, you absolutely wanted the dwale. You wanted all of the dwale. The alternative was being held down by several strong men while someone went at your limb with a saw designed for woodworking, and consciousness during that experience was not recommended. Medieval medical texts describe dwale's effects with a kind of grim enthusiasm. The patient becomes as dead, unresponsive to pain, and if you gave them enough, sometimes they actually did become dead, which was considered an acceptable risk given the alternative. The line between enough to prevent suffering and enough to stop breathing was fuzzy, and medieval physicians were working without precise measurements, consistent ingredients, or any real understanding of pharmacology. They were eyeballing doses of substances that could kill you, which explains why so many medieval medical treatments have a mortality rate that modern doctors would consider unacceptably high. But opium remained throughout this entire period in the category of powerful medicine that requires respect. It wasn't recreational. It wasn't casual. It wasn't something you took because you were bored or curious. It was what you took when something was seriously wrong and you needed it fixed, or at least numbed into submission. The social structures, the limited supply, the expense, the fact that you generally needed a physician's involvement. All of these factors kept opium contained within relatively narrow boundaries. That containment was about to explode, and the explosion would be triggered by something that seems almost comically mundane. Europeans really wanted spices, silk and tea, and they were willing to restructure the entire global economy to get them. The 16th century was when everything started getting complicated in ways that would take centuries to fully unpack, and we're still unpacking them today. European powers, fresh off the realization that there were entire continents they hadn't yet claimed and populated with flags, began establishing trade routes to Asia. Portugal got there first, setting up trading posts along the coast of India, and quickly realizing that Asia had a lot of things Europe wanted. Spices that made food taste like something other than despair, silk that was softer than anything European looms could produce, and opium, lots of opium, high-quality opium. Opium that grew beautifully in India's climate and that had an established market throughout Asia. And European traders, being European traders in the age of exploration, looked at this situation and thought, how do we monetize this? The answer, it turned out, was aggressively. The Portuguese were first to start shipping opium back to Europe, but they were quickly joined by the Dutch and then the British, whose East India Company would eventually turn opium trading into one of history's most profitable and morally bankrupt business operations. The East India Company wasn't really a company in the modern sense. It was more like a colonial government with shareholders, a private army, and the enthusiastic backing of the British Crown. It had the power to wage war, negotiate treaties, and control vast territories. And it discovered that opium was an excellent product to trade. Why? Because opium had several qualities that made it perfect for international commerce. It was compact. You could ship large amounts in relatively small spaces. It was non-perishable. It didn't rot on long sea voyages. It was highly valued. People would pay significant money for it. And it had a customer base that, once established, tended to remain extremely loyal. Addiction, from a business perspective, is fantastic for repeat sales. It's built-in customer retention. In England, opium arrived in various forms throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. You could get raw opium, which looked like dark brown chunks of resin that you could eat, dissolve in wine or smoke if you had the right equipment. But the form that really took off was laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, invented by the Swiss physician Paracelsus in the 16th century. Paracelsus was a fascinating character, part brilliant medical innovator, part absolute chaos agent. He publicly burned traditional medical texts, claimed he had discovered the philosopher's stone and named his laudanum from the Latin laudare, meaning to praise. This gives you some idea of his opinion of his own creation. He wasn't being modest. He called it the stone of immortality and claimed it could cure basically everything. He was wildly overstating things, but he wasn't entirely wrong about its effectiveness. Laudanum became the aspirin of the early modern period. It treated pain, obviously, but also coughs, diarrhea, insomnia, anxiety, melancholy, and the general condition of being alive in the 1600s, which was its own kind of chronic ailment. In an era before antibiotics, before anesthesia, before any real understanding of what caused disease, laudanum was one of the few medicines that did something noticeable and did it quickly. Doctors prescribed it for their patients. Pharmacists sold it over the counter to anyone who walked in. Parents gave it to children who wouldn't sleep. It was as common as aspirin is today, except instead of blocking pain signals through prostaglandin inhibition, it was fundamentally rewiring your brain's relationship with suffering by flooding it with opioids. But no one knew that part yet. They just knew it worked. And because it worked, because it was legal, because it was socially acceptable, opium began its slow, steady integration into everyday European life. It became medicine, commerce, habit, and eventually dependency, all while maintaining complete respectability. The transformation from carefully controlled ancient remedy to thing you can buy at any pharmacy happened gradually enough that no one really noticed they were watching the beginning of something that would eventually require multiple wars, ruin millions of lives, and create public health crises that would last centuries. The poppies kept growing, the sap kept flowing, and the market kept expanding, because once you've introduced a population to effective pain relief, they tend to want to keep having it. That's not a moral failing. That's just biology meeting commerce, and that meeting would soon become a collision that reshapes global politics. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand how something grown in fields, processed by farmers, and sold in shops became the foundation of empires and the cause of wars. Because that's where this story gets really dark and also somehow even more absurd. By the 1600s and 1700s, Britain had developed what historians might politely call an enthusiasm for opium, and what anyone being honest would call a rapidly growing national drug habit masquerading as medicine. Laudanum wasn't just available in England, it was everywhere. You could buy it at pharmacies, obviously, but also at general stores, from travelling salesmen who went door to door like they were selling encyclopedias instead of liquid narcotics, and from anyone who had a bottle and an entrepreneurial spirit. It was also remarkably cheap. In many places, laudanum cost less than beer, which created the rather surreal situation where the economically rational choice for someone in pain was to get high rather than get drunk. If you were a factory worker with a persistent cough, a domestic servant with chronic back pain, or a mother with colicky baby who hadn't slept in 3 days, laudanum was your obvious solution. A few drops in water, a few minutes of waiting, and relief. Blessed, chemical relief that asks no questions about your social class or your ability to pay a doctor. The Victorian era, which we remember for its prudishness, moral rigidity, and the kind of sexual repression that required covering piano legs because exposed furniture was apparently too suggestive, was absolutely drowning in opiates. This is one of history's better ironies. The same society that couldn't acknowledge that women had legs was also dosing children with morphine and selling opium-laced lozenges marketed as soothing right next to the peppermints. Middle-class and upper-class households kept laudanum in their medicine cabinets the way we keep ibuprofen today, except ibuprofen doesn't create physical dependency or stop your breathing if you miscalculate the dose. Dinner parties would be interrupted so guests could take their evening laudanum. Women would dose themselves before social events to manage anxiety. Men would dose themselves after work to manage stress. Everyone was just medicating their way through Victorian life, and no one thought this was particularly concerning because everyone else was doing it too. But the real market was in patent medicines, proprietary formulas with names that sounded vaguely medical and promises that sounded completely magical. These were the Victorian equivalent of late-night infomercial products, except instead of promising to revolutionise your kitchen storage, they promised to revolutionise your entire existence. Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup was one of the most popular, marketed specifically for teething babies, and sold with the kind of aggressive advertising campaign that modern pharmaceutical companies would recognise and respect. The label featured a gentle maternal figure and soothing promises about calming restless infants. What it didn't prominently feature was the ingredient list, which included morphine, not a little morphine. Enough morphine that babies given Mrs. Winslow stopped crying, slept deeply, and in some cases stopped breathing entirely, which was less soothing and more permanent than advertised. The product remained on the market for decades. Mothers bought it, used it, recommended it to friends, and occasionally buried their children without ever connecting the soothing syrup to the fact that their baby had stopped being soothed in the most final way possible. The manufacturer eventually added a warning label, not because of regulations, those didn't really exist yet, but because enough babies had died that even Victorian society, which had a pretty high tolerance for child mortality, started asking questions. Godfrey's cordial was another favourite, particularly among working-class families who couldn't afford doctors or time off work for sick children. It was cheap, effective at calming children, and contained enough opium that regular use led to what doctors delicately called infant dependency. Some children, given Godfrey's daily from infancy, developed withdrawal symptoms when the supply ran out. They'd become irritable, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, cried inconsolably. Parents, not understanding what was happening, interpreted this as the child being sick again and gave them more cordial, which fixed the withdrawal symptoms immediately, thereby proving to the parents that the medicine was working. This is how addiction gets mistaken for treatment. The drug creates the problem, then temporarily solves the problem, and the cycle continues until someone figures out what's actually happening. In Victorian England, very few people figured it out. There are medical records from this period documenting children dying from opiate overdoses, often because dosing was wildly inconsistent. Patent medicines didn't list their actual morphine content. One bottle of soothing syrup might contain twice as much as another from the same brand, because quality control wasn't really a concept yet. Manufacturers were just mixing opiates into liquid and eyeballing the proportions. Parents, desperate to quiet a screaming child, would give another spoonful, then another, and sometimes the child simply didn't wake up. And yet, the moral panic that would later attach itself to opiate addiction was almost entirely absent during this period. People didn't think of laudanum as a dangerous drug. They thought of it as medicine. Even people who took it daily, who physically needed it to function, who would become violently ill if they stopped, weren't considered addicts in the modern sense. They were considered invalids, people with chronic conditions requiring ongoing treatment. The word addiction existed, but it meant something closer to devotion or excessive fondness. You could be addicted to reading, to gambling, to tea drinking. It was a character flaw, lack of discipline, but it wasn't understood as a medical condition with neurological foundations. This distinction is important because it reveals how completely Victorian society misunderstood what was happening. They saw people who couldn't stop taking laudanum and thought weak-willed. They didn't think physically dependent due to altered brain chemistry. The science to understand addiction wouldn't exist for another century, so they were left interpreting a biological phenomenon through a moral framework, which is like trying to fix a computer by praying at it. You can try, but you're addressing the wrong system. Some people did notice patterns. Thomas de Quincey, a writer and philosopher, published Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821, one of the first accounts of opiate addiction written from the inside. He described his initial use of opium for dental pain. He'd had terrible toothaches and a doctor suggested laudanum, which worked immediately and beautifully. The pain vanished. He felt wonderful. He started taking it regularly, not just for pain, but for the pleasant mental effects. His doses increased. He started having strange, vivid dreams that he described in prose that makes you wonder how much laudanum he was on while writing about the laudanum. Then he tried to quit, and discovered that stopping opium after long-term use was absolutely horrific. He described sweating, shaking, terrible nightmares, crushing anxiety, and a depression so profound he considered suicide as a reasonable alternative to continued withdrawal. He called opium the dread agent of unimaginable pleasure and pain, which is perhaps the most accurate description of opiates ever written. The book became a bestseller. Victorian readers found it thrilling, scandalous, and deeply relatable. Many recognised their own experiences in De Quincey's descriptions, that slow slide from medicinal use to dependency, the gradual realisation that you weren't taking opium to feel good anymore, you were taking it to avoid feeling terrible. But instead of prompting medical investigation or public health concern, the book was largely read as a confessional memoir, a personal moral struggle. It was entertainment, not a warning. People read it the way we watch documentaries about people with strange obsessions. Fascinating, but not applicable to us. We're different. We're just using medicine. While Britain was busy medicating its entire population into functional opiate dependency, it was also looking at China and seeing a business opportunity that would make modern drug cartels look like amateurs. Here's the situation. Britain loved Chinese tea. Loved it. The British population was consuming tea at rates that suggested they'd replaced their blood with it. They also loved Chinese silk and Chinese porcelain. But China didn't want anything Britain was selling. No wool, no manufactured goods, no industrial innovations. Chinese officials looked at British products and essentially said, "We're good, thanks." What China wanted was silver, hard currency, and Britain's silver reserves were draining fast. This was economically unsustainable and diplomatically embarrassing. Britain was essentially a customer with no money trying to convince a shopkeeper to accept IOUs, and China was not interested. The British needed something China wanted, something they could produce or control, something that would balance the trade deficit. They chose opium. This wasn't an accident or a side effect. This was deliberate policy, worked out in boardrooms and approved by government officials. The British East India Company controlled vast poppy fields in India, specifically Bengal, where opium grew beautifully and labour was cheap. They could produce opium on an industrial scale, refine it, package it, and ship it to China. And if China didn't want to buy it through official channels, they'd simply sell it through unofficial ones, using smugglers and corrupt Chinese officials who were happy to look the other way for a cut of the profits. China had actually banned opium imports in 1729, which the British interpreted less as a legal prohibition and more as a minor logistical challenge. The Chinese government said opium was causing social problems, that people were spending all their money on it, abandoning their families, neglecting their work, and generally dissolving into narcotic fog. The British response was essentially, sounds like a demand problem, not a supply problem, and kept shipping it anyway. By the early 1800s, opium smuggling into China was massive, organised, and incredibly profitable. British and American merchants, working with Chinese smugglers and corrupt officials, moved thousands of chests of opium into the country every year. Each chest contained about 140 pounds of opium, enough to supply a small city's worth of addiction. The scale was staggering. By 1838, over 40,000 chests were entering China annually, and the social impact was becoming catastrophic. Opium dens proliferated in Chinese cities. These weren't the genteel sitting rooms where British middle-class citizens took their evening laudanum while discussing literature. These were dark, smoky rooms where people came to forget everything. The customers ranged from labourers to scholars to government officials, because addiction doesn't particularly care about your social status. Productivity collapsed. Tax revenue dropped. Families fell apart. The Chinese government watched its population slowly drift away into opium dreams and decided enough was enough. In 1839, the Chinese emperor appointed Lin Zexu, a scholar official with a reputation for absolute incorruptibility and a complete lack of patience for nonsense, to solve the opium problem. Lin took his mandate seriously, with the energy of someone who just discovered his house was on fire and everyone else was standing around debating fire safety regulations. He went to Canton, the centre of the opium trade, and demanded that foreign merchants surrender their opium. Not gradually, not with negotiations, immediately. The merchants, who'd been operating in a moral grey zone, so dark it was basically black, tried to stall. They argued about property rights, about contracts, about the sanctity of international trade. Lin was unmoved. He blockaded the foreign quarter of Canton and refused to let anyone leave until they complied. No food in, no people out, just everyone sitting there thinking about whether their opium was worth starving over. Eventually, they surrendered about 20,000 chests of opium, over 1.4 million pounds of the stuff, enough to get a significant fraction of China's population high. Lin ordered it mixed with lime and salt and flushed into the ocean, a process that took weeks and probably created the world's most confused fish population. Imagine being a fish, and suddenly your entire environment tastes like someone dissolved a pharmacy into it. Then Lin did something remarkable. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. It's one of history's most polite acts of diplomatic fury, and it deserves to be read in full, but the essence was this. Your Majesty, you ban opium in England because you know it's harmful. You know it destroys lives. So why are you selling it to us? You profit from poisoning our people. Is this moral? Is this just? How do you justify this? It was a legitimate question that cut through all the economic justifications and trade rhetoric to the core moral issue. Britain was doing to China what it wouldn't allow to be done to its own citizens. The British response was to send gunboats, which is perhaps the most on-brand British response possible. You can almost hear the government discussion. They destroyed our opium and wrote us a strongly worded letter. Should we reconsider our policies? No, let's shoot them. The First Opium War began in 1839 and lasted until 1842, and calling it a war is generous to China. It was more like a military demonstration of why industrialization and superior naval technology matter. Britain had steamships, modern artillery, and marines who'd spent the last few centuries conquering increasingly annoyed populations around the world. China had traditional junks, outdated weapons, and soldiers who were very brave but comprehensively outgunned. Britain won decisively, which everyone knew they would, because the point wasn't military victory. The point was humiliation, leverage, and forcing China to accept terms so one-sided they barely qualified as negotiation. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, forced China to pay massive reparations for the destroyed opium, essentially making China pay for the drugs that were destroying its population, open 5 ports to British trade with no restrictions, and cede Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. Opium wasn't mentioned in the treaty. It didn't need to be. The war had made the point exquisitely clear. Britain would sell opium to China, and China would accept it, or there would be military consequences. The subtext was, we will literally wage war to maintain our drug trafficking operation and will make you pay for the privilege. This wasn't enough for Britain apparently, because in 1856 they started a second opium war, this time with France enthusiastically joining in. The pretext was different, something about a ship and an insult to the British flag, but the underlying issue was the same. China was still being difficult about the whole, please let us addict your population to drugs thing. The second opium war was even more one-sided than the first. British and French forces occupied Beijing, burned the old summer palace, an act of cultural destruction so thorough that pieces of the destroyed artifacts are still being discovered in European collections, and forced China into even more unequal treaties. More ports opened, more trade concessions granted, and this time opium was explicitly legalized. China had to officially allow opium imports, tax them like legitimate goods, and abandon any pretense that this wasn't happening. By the 1860s, opium was fully legal throughout China, and the addiction crisis that had prompted Lin Zexu's desperate intervention was now permanent national policy. It's estimated that by the late 19th century, somewhere between 10 to 20% of China's adult male population was addicted to opium. Entire generations grew up in a society where opium dens were as common as taverns, where addiction was normalized, where the drug that was supposed to relieve suffering became the source of it. It's hard to overstate how cynical this entire situation was. Britain fought 2 wars, killed thousands of people, occupied Beijing, destroyed priceless cultural artifacts, and imposed treaties so unequal they're still called unequal treaties in Chinese history textbooks, all to maintain the right to sell addictive drugs to a population that clearly didn't want them. And they did this while claiming to be champions of free trade, civilization, and Christian values. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain these positions simultaneously must have been Olympic level. The economic logic was simple. Opium sales to China paid for British tea imports. which funded the British government through tea taxes, which funded the empire's expansion, which allowed more opium production in India, which enabled more sales to China. It was a self-sustaining loop of addiction and profit that generated enormous wealth for British merchants and the government while destroying Chinese society. From a purely economic standpoint, it was brilliant. From every other standpoint, it was monstrous, and the people actually growing the opium, Indian farmers working in Bengal, saw almost none of the profits. They were required to grow poppies instead of food crops, paid minimal amounts, and trapped in a system where the East India Company controlled production, pricing and distribution. If the farmers tried to grow something else or sell to someone else, there were consequences. The entire operation was exploitation at multiple levels. British merchants exploiting Chinese, consumers, the British government exploiting Indian farmers, and everyone involved pretending this was just normal international trade rather than state-sponsored drug trafficking. Meanwhile, back in England, opium use continued to rise, but it looked completely different from the Chinese opium crisis. British opiate users were taking laudanum prescribed by doctors, buying patent medicines from respectable pharmacies, maintaining jobs and families while managing their dependencies quietly and privately. Chinese opiate users were smoking opium in dens, visibly intoxicated, socially marginalised, and used as examples of moral degradation and racial inferiority in British media and political discourse. Same drug, different contexts, completely different social and political responses. When Chinese people used opium, it was evidence of their weakness and backwardness, proof that they needed British civilization and Christian guidance. When British people used opium, it was medicine, respectability, and nobody's business. The racism wasn't subtle. It was the entire framework through which opium use was understood and discussed. This double standard would continue for over a century, shaping drug policy, medical practice, and public health responses in ways we're still untangling today. The idea that some drug use is medicine and some is moral failure, that identical behaviours can be treated completely differently based on who's doing them, that addiction in some populations deserves treatment, while addiction in others deserves punishment. All of these ideas have roots in the Opium Wars and the Victorian opium trade. The British Empire built significant portions of its wealth on opium. Hong Kong, which Britain would control until 1997, was originally acquired through an opium war. The grand buildings in London, the country estates, the fortunes of merchant families, much of it was paid for with opium profits, and it was all legal, respectable, defended by the government and celebrated as commercial success. The poppies kept growing in Bengal, the sap kept flowing, the opium kept shipping to China, and the profits kept rolling in. And in Britain's domestic market, laudanum sales continued to rise, patent medicines continued to promise miracles, and nobody in power seriously questioned whether maybe, just maybe, building an empire on addiction might have consequences beyond the immediate quarterly profits. Those consequences were coming. They were already visible if anyone cared to look. Rising addiction rates, increasing overdoses, children dying from patent medicine, accidents, families destroyed by dependencies that started as legitimate medical treatment. But looking at consequences requires admitting there's a problem, and admitting there's a problem requires either solving it or accepting complicity. The Victorian era chose complicity, wrapped it in respectability, and sold it in pharmacies next to the peppermints. The American experience with opium started the way most American experiences start, by watching Europeans do something and thinking, we could do that, but bigger and with less regulation. By the mid-1800s, the United States was developing its own enthusiastic relationship with opiates, fueled by patent medicines a medical system that was half science and half Wild West showmanship, and a complete absence of anyone asking, should we maybe think about this before we sell morphine through mail order catalogues? But the real catalyst for American opiate addiction came from the place where many American problems originate. A massive, brutal war that everyone involved wishes they could take back. The Civil War was a watershed moment for American drug use, and not in a good way. It was one of the first wars where large numbers of soldiers survived catastrophic injuries thanks to advances in battlefield medicine. Unfortunately, those advances were mostly limited to, we can amputate faster now, and didn't extend to infection control, sterile technique, or really any understanding of why wounds kept getting infected and killing people anyway. Surgeons were saving lives by removing mangled limbs with impressive speed, then watching those same soldiers die from infections because no one had figured out that maybe washing your hands between patients might help. The ones who survived surgery faced a different problem. Pain. Extraordinary, constant, overwhelming pain. Pain from shattered bones, from amputated limbs, from wounds that wouldn't heal, from infections slowly eating through tissue. And the standard treatment for all of this was morphine, administered liberally, enthusiastically, and without any serious thought about long-term consequences, because long-term consequences required surviving long-term first. Morphine is opium's more sophisticated, more dangerous cousin, isolated from opium by a German pharmacist in 1804 and named after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, which should have been everyone's first hint that this drug had some serious side effects. It's about 10 times more potent than raw opium, which means it's exponentially more effective for severe pain, and also exponentially more effective at rewiring your brain's reward system into thinking it cannot survive without regular injections of morphine. By the 1860s, morphine could be administered via hypodermic syringe, a recent invention that had everyone in the medical community very excited, because it meant drugs could be delivered directly into the bloodstream. This was considered revolutionary, a massive improvement over oral administration. Injected morphine worked faster, more reliably, and more completely than anything that had to go through the digestive system first. It was perfect for battlefield conditions. What nobody fully appreciated at the time was that injection also made addiction more likely and more severe. When you bypass the digestive system and deliver drugs straight to the bloodstream, you're creating an immediate, intense reward signal in the brain. It's the difference between gradually warming up by a fire and being hit by a flamethrower. Your brain learns very, very quickly that needle equals instant relief, and that learning becomes hardwired with a speed that oral drugs can't match. Civil War field hospitals became assembly lines of morphine administration. Surgeons would treat dozens of wounded soldiers in a day, each one getting morphine before, during, and after their procedures. Soldiers recovering in hospitals received regular morphine doses for pain management. By the time they were well enough to be discharged, many had been receiving morphine for weeks or months, long enough for their brains to completely restructure around its presence. Thousands of veterans returned home with what became known as soldier's disease, or army disease, euphemisms for morphine addiction that allowed everyone to avoid saying the word addiction out loud. These were men who'd survived some of the bloodiest battles in American history: Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh. And they came home physically scarred, psychologically traumatized, and chemically dependent on morphine. The government didn't provide treatment, support, or even acknowledgement that this was a problem. Veterans were simply sent home, often with a supply of morphine and of vague instructions to use as needed, which is excellent medical advice if your goal is to create lifelong addiction. For many veterans, as needed became constantly. They couldn't function without it. Withdrawal from morphine after long-term use is spectacularly unpleasant. Sweating, shaking, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle pain, bone pain, anxiety that makes you feel like your skin is trying to escape your body, insomnia so profound you'd give anything to sleep for even an hour, and a psychological despair so crushing that death seems like a reasonable alternative. This lasts for days, sometimes weeks, and the failure rate for attempting to quit cold turkey is extraordinarily high because you're not just fighting physical symptoms, you're fighting brain changes that have become your new biological baseline. Veterans described morphine withdrawal as worse than anything they'd experienced in combat, which is saying something when you're talking about men who'd watched their friends die in trenches and had their own limbs removed with Civil War-era surgical techniques. So they kept using. They bought morphine from pharmacies, ordered it from mail-order catalogues that advertised in newspapers, did whatever they had to do to maintain their supply. And nobody called them addicts. They were wounded veterans, heroes who'd sacrificed for their country. The fact that their sacrifice included becoming dependent on narcotics was just one more tragedy in a war full of them, one more thing everyone agreed to politely ignore. Meanwhile, patent medicine salesmen were having the time of their lives. The post-Civil War era was the absolute golden age of medical fraud, that beautiful period in American history when anyone with a bottle, a printing press, and a complete absence of conscience could claim their product cured literally anything and face zero legal consequences. These medicines promised to cure cancer, tuberculosis, alcoholism, opiate addiction with opiates, female complaints, anything involving women having feelings, nervous exhaustion, existing in the 19th century, and tired blood, which wasn't a real medical condition but sounded bad enough that people would pay to fix it. Most of these miracle cures contained some combination of opium, morphine, cocaine, alcohol, or all of the above. They worked, in the sense that they made people feel dramatically better temporarily, which customers interpreted as curing whatever was wrong with them. They also created customers for life, which was excellent for business and catastrophic for public health. But public health wasn't really a concept yet, so nobody in charge was particularly worried about it. One particularly egregious example was Bayer heroin, which deserves its own moment of stunned appreciation for the sheer audacity involved. In 1898, the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company, yes, the same Bayer that makes aspirin, the same Bayer that still exists today, introduced heroin as a cough suppressant and morphine substitute. The name heroin came from heroisch, German for heroic, because it made patients feel heroic, powerful, invincible. This should have been everyone's second hint that maybe this drug had some problematic effects. But Bayer was very excited about their new product. They claimed heroin was safer than morphine, non-addictive, and perfect for treating everything from coughs to breathing problems to morphine addiction itself. Let's take a moment to appreciate that last claim. They were marketing heroin as a cure for morphine addiction. This is like marketing cigarettes as a cure for pipe smoking. Technically, they're different delivery systems, but you're still just swapping one addiction for another, possibly worse one. This was spectacularly catastrophically wrong. Heroin is diacetyl morphine, a semi-synthetic opioid that's significantly more potent than morphine. It crosses the blood-brain barrier more easily, creates a more intense euphoric effect, and leads to physical dependence faster than morphine. It's everything morphine is, but more so, concentrated, weaponized. Bayer had essentially taken morphine and made it worse, then marketed it as safer. It's like they'd invented a disease and sold it as medicine. Bayer marketed heroin aggressively, including to children. They produced advertisements showing happy children and reassuring mothers, promising that heroin would soothe coughs and help kids sleep through the night. They weren't technically lying. Heroin absolutely does both of those things. it also creates addiction in developing brains even faster than in adults, but Bayer didn't mention that part. For over a decade, heroin was sold over the counter, prescribed by doctors, given to children, and genuinely believed to be a medical breakthrough. By the time medical professionals realised that heroin was creating a new, worse wave of addiction, it was too late. Heroin had spread globally, and a whole new generation of users had discovered that the drug marketed as a safe alternative to morphine was actually the pharmaceutical equivalent of jumping out of the frying pan and into an active volcano. But here's what's crucial to understand. None of this was hidden. It wasn't a conspiracy or a cover-up. It was just ignorance combined with capitalism and a light seasoning of nobody's job is to stop this. Pharmaceutical companies sold opiates because they were profitable and legal. Doctors prescribed them because they worked and because they trusted pharmaceutical companies to tell them the truth about their products, which in retrospect was optimistic to the point of naivety. Patients took them because they provided relief and because their doctors said it was fine. And the idea that these drugs could fundamentally alter brain chemistry, creating physical dependencies that had nothing to do with moral character or willpower, simply wasn't part of the cultural or medical understanding yet. The scientific framework to understand addiction wouldn't develop for another several decades, which meant everyone was trying to interpret neurochemical phenomena through moral frameworks. They saw people who couldn't stop taking morphine or heroin and thought weak-willed or morally deficient or lack of character. They didn't think altered dopamine regulation or hijacked reward pathways or neuroplasticity gone wrong, because those concepts didn't exist in common understanding yet. It's like trying to fix a car engine when you don't know cars have engines. You can try various things: prayer, hitting it with a hammer, angry reasoning, but you're fundamentally addressing the wrong system with the wrong tools. It would take mounting addiction rates, increasing deaths, and growing social disruption before anyone seriously questioned whether maybe, just maybe, selling powerful narcotics to anyone with pocket change and a cough wasn't optimal public policy. But that realization wouldn't come from medical insight or public health concern. It would come from racism, xenophobia, and the dawning awareness that opiate addiction was no longer contained to acceptable populations. The early 20th century was when the cultural understanding of opiate addiction began to shift, slowly and reluctantly, like an oil tanker trying to turn around in a narrow canal. The shift wasn't driven by science, compassion, or any sophisticated understanding of addiction as a medical condition. It was driven by the fact that the wrong people were using drugs in visible ways, and that made everyone uncomfortable. Chinese immigrants had been scapegoated for opium use since the mid-1800s, despite the fact that Britain and America were the ones who'd created the global opium market in the first place. American newspapers ran sensationalized stories about opium dens corrupting innocent white youth, about Chinese men luring white women into lives of addiction and sexual degradation, about the yellow peril spreading across America through smoke-filled rooms and narcotic fog. These stories were largely fabricated, wildly exaggerated, or based on isolated incidents blown up into racial panic, but they served a political purpose. They justified discriminatory laws and stoked anti-Chinese sentiment that would culminate in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The real issue wasn't that Chinese immigrants were using opium. The issue was that they were visible while using it. White middle-class morphine users, taking their medicine in private homes with prescriptions from respectable doctors, were patients with medical conditions. Chinese labourers smoking opium in communal rooms were dangerous degenerates corrupting American society. Same drug, same addiction, different contexts, completely different responses. It's almost like the problem wasn't the drug at all, but who was using it and where. By the early 1900s, progressive-era reformers, motivated by a genuine concern about public health, mixed with a not-so-genuine concern about immigrants and racial purity, began calling for regulation. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was a major step, requiring manufacturers to list ingredients on patent medicine labels. This meant customers finally learned that their soothing syrup contained morphine, their vitality tonic contained cocaine, and their health elixir was basically just alcohol with extra steps. Sales dropped, but not as dramatically as you'd think. Many people, having read the label and learned about the morphine content, shrugged and bought it anyway because it worked, and they were already dependent. Knowing something contains addictive substances doesn't help much when you're already addicted. It's like warning someone their parachute contains a parachute after they've already jumped out of the plane. The information is technically useful, but practically irrelevant at that point. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 was more significant and more problematic. It didn't ban opiates outright, but it required doctors and pharmacists to register with the federal government, pay a tax, and keep detailed records of all opiate prescriptions and sales. The stated purpose was to control distribution and prevent non-medical use, which sounds reasonable until you examine what non-medical use meant in practice. The law drew a distinction that seems clear in theory, but was a nightmare in practice. Doctors could prescribe opiates for medical treatment, but they couldn't prescribe them solely to maintain an addiction. If someone was in pain, a prescription was legal. If someone was dependent and needed opiates to avoid withdrawal, a prescription was illegal. The problem was that chronic pain and addiction often coexist in the same person, and telling them apart isn't straightforward. Where does pain treatment end and addiction maintenance begin? The law didn't clarify, leaving doctors terrified of prosecution. Many doctors, facing the possibility of fines, imprisonment, or losing their licenses, simply stopped prescribing opiates entirely. Better safe than in federal prison. Patients who'd been maintaining stable, functional lives with medical opiate prescriptions suddenly found themselves cut off. They couldn't function without the drugs, not because they lacked willpower, but because their bodies had physiologically adapted to regular opiate use. Their brains had restructured around the assumption that opiates would be present. Without them, they weren't just uncomfortable, they were in genuine medical crisis. So they turned to the black market, which is how the Harrison Act accidentally created America's first major illicit drug trade. Before 1914, there was no real underground market for opiates, because you could buy them legally at any pharmacy. After 1914, demand didn't disappear. It just went underground, where quality control didn't exist. Prices were higher, purity was uncertain, and violence became a standard business practice. Thousands of people, many of them middle-aged, middle-class, previously law-abiding citizens, became criminals overnight. They weren't seeking euphoria. They weren't recreational users. They were trying to avoid withdrawal, and the legal system treated them exactly the same as dealers and smugglers. This was also when addiction became firmly medicalized as a disease, but not in a helpful way. Addiction was considered a disease like leprosy was considered a disease. Something shameful, possibly contagious, definitely deserving of isolation. Narcotic farms were established, essentially prison hospitals where addicts were sent for treatment. Treatment consisted of forced withdrawal with minimal medical support, hard labour, and lectures about moral character that would make Victorian ministers seem laid back by comparison. The withdrawal process, unsupported and forced, was brutal. Its flu-like symptoms dialed up to nightmare intensity: profuse sweating, violent shaking, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle pain, bone pain, anxiety so severe it feels like impending death, insomnia that lasts for days, and psychological despair that makes every minute feel like an hour. This continues for a week or more, and the medical staff at these facilities treated it as something to be endured, not managed. The philosophy was that suffering would build character and teach addicts not to use drugs, which is like thinking you can teach someone not to have diabetes by making insulin very difficult to obtain. The failure rate was predictably high. Most people left narcotic farms and relapsed, immediately, not because they lacked moral fibre, but because forced withdrawal doesn't address the underlying brain changes that created the dependency. You're just torturing someone until the acute physical symptoms subside, then releasing them back into the same circumstances that led to drug use in the first place. It's the medical equivalent of putting a band-aid on a bullet wound and declaring the patient cured. By the 1920s and 1930s, the cultural image of the drug addict had solidified into something very specific and very racialized. A criminal, probably poor, probably foreign or black, probably dangerous, definitely deserving of punishment rather than help. This image bore almost no resemblance to the reality of who was actually using opiates, which was a much wider demographic cross-section, but it served political purposes and simplified complicated social problems into narratives about good people versus bad people. This is where Harry Anslinger enters the story, and he enters it like a villain in a morality play who's absolutely convinced he's the hero. Anslinger was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, appointed in 1930, and he spent the next 3 decades waging an aggressive public campaign against drugs, with the kind of zealous enthusiasm usually reserved for religious crusades. He gave speeches, wrote articles, testified before Congress, and painted drug use as a moral plague that would destroy American civilization if not contained through increasingly harsh laws. His rhetoric was effective because it tapped directly into existing prejudices and fears. He associated marijuana with Mexican immigrants and jazz musicians, opium with Chinese labourers, and cocaine with black Americans. He didn't need to explicitly say, "These drugs make inferior races dangerous." The implication was built into every speech, every article, every congressional testimony. And Congress, eager to appear tough on crime and moral decay, passed increasingly harsh drug laws that created mandatory minimum sentences and filled prisons with people whose primary crime was being addicted to substances that were legal and widely available just a generation earlier. The result was a system where addiction was treated as a criminal justice problem rather than a public health problem. Instead of treatment, addicts got jail time. Instead of research into addiction mechanisms or better pain management alternatives, resources went into enforcement, prosecution, and incarceration. The war on drugs had begun, though it wouldn't be called that officially until Nixon, and it would continue for the next century with devastating consequences that we're still dealing with today. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies continued developing new opiates, because the profit motive doesn't stop just because addiction is now illegal. Methadone was synthesized in Germany in the 1930s, initially as a painkiller and later repurposed as an addiction treatment. The theory was elegant. Methadone is a long-acting opioid that prevents withdrawal symptoms without creating the euphoric rush of heroin. Patients could take methadone once a day, function normally, hold jobs, maintain relationships, and gradually taper off or remain on maintenance indefinitely. In practice, methadone became its own form of dependency. It worked. Patients on methadone maintenance could stabilize their lives dramatically, but they were still taking an opioid, and stopping methadone still caused withdrawal. Some people stayed on methadone for years, decades, lifetimes. This raised an uncomfortable question that's still debated today. Is methadone maintenance recovery, or is it just trading one addiction for another? The answer depends entirely on how you define recovery. If recovery means total abstinence from all opioids, then methadone maintenance is just extended addiction with medical supervision. If recovery means functional stability, reduced harm, improved quality of life, and the ability to participate in society, then methadone is successful treatment. This isn't a trivial semantic debate. How we define recovery determines what kind of treatment we fund, what outcomes we value, and what we expect from people struggling with addiction. By the 1950s and 60s, heroin had become the dominant illegal opiate in America. Morphine required medical connections or pharmaceutical access. Heroin could be manufactured in clandestine labs, smuggled in luggage or shipping containers, and sold on street corners by dealers who definitely weren't checking IDs or providing dosing information. It was more concentrated than morphine, easier to transport and more profitable per unit of weight, making it ideal for international trafficking. The heroin trade became global, with major supply routes running from Turkey through France to New York in what became known as the French Connection. Afghanistan also emerged as a major opium producer, with poppies growing beautifully in mountain regions where few other crops thrived. The Golden Triangle, spanning Burma, Laos and Thailand, became another major source, with production increasing dramatically during the Vietnam War when American military presence in the region created both demand and convenient distribution networks. Vietnam itself created a new wave of American addiction, and the government's response to it briefly, almost accidentally, treated addiction as the medical problem it actually is. Soldiers in Vietnam had remarkably easy access to cheap, high-purity heroin. In combat zones, stress was unbearable, death was constant, and heroin was everywhere. Some estimates suggest up to 20% of American servicemen used heroin while deployed. The drug was cheap enough that even junior enlisted soldiers could afford it, pure enough to be effective at low doses, and unlike alcohol, it didn't impair combat readiness as obviously. You could use heroin and still function tactically, which made it appealing in circumstances where functionality might determine whether you survived the next patrol. When these soldiers started returning home, the Nixon administration faced the terrifying possibility of hundreds of thousands of heroin-addicted veterans flooding back into American society. This could have been treated as a criminal problem, which would have been consistent with drug policy at the time. Instead, Nixon, who would later launch the war on drugs with enthusiasm, briefly funded research into addiction treatment and created programs specifically to help veterans. This was one of the few moments in American history when addiction was treated primarily as a medical problem requiring medical solutions rather than a crime requiring punishment. The research produced fascinating findings that directly contradicted conventional wisdom about addiction. Most Vietnam veterans who used heroin overseas didn't continue using it at home. Once removed from the extreme stress of combat and placed back in familiar environments with social support structures, most simply stopped. No treatment, no intervention, just context change. This suggested something revolutionary, that addiction isn't purely about the drug's chemical properties. It's about the interaction between the drug, the person, and their environment. Context matters, stress matters, available alternatives matter. Whether life feels livable without drugs matters enormously. This insight should have transformed addiction treatment and drug policy. Instead, it was largely ignored as soon as the immediate veteran crisis subsided, because it was politically and economically inconvenient. The war on drugs, launched by Nixon and escalated dramatically by Reagan in the 1980s, doubled down on the criminal justice approach. Mandatory minimum sentences for drug offences filled prisons to unprecedented levels. The crack epidemic, which was chemically distinct from opiates but treated similarly by the legal system, devastated black communities and led to mass incarceration on a scale that made America the world's leading incarcerator by an embarrassingly wide margin. Through all of this, pharmaceutical companies were quietly developing new opioids, refining their formulations, perfecting their marketing strategies, and waiting for the right cultural moment to reintroduce prescription opioids as safe, effective, definitely not addictive this time. We promised solutions for chronic pain. That moment was coming, and it would create a crisis that would make everything before it looked like practice. The late 20th century created a perfect storm of factors that would lead to the modern opioid crisis. And by perfect storm, I mean a combination of legitimate medical concerns, pharmaceutical greed, regulatory failure, and collective amnesia about literally everything history had tried to teach us about opiates. It's like watching someone confidently step on the same rake that's been hitting people in the face for 3,000 years and being genuinely surprised when it hits them in the face. In the 1980s and 90s, pain management became a major focus in American medicine, and for genuinely good reasons. Doctors and patient advocates noticed that people suffering from chronic pain were being undertreated. That pain was often dismissed or minimized, especially in cancer patients, elderly patients, and anyone whose pain couldn't be easily measured or proven. This was a legitimate problem. Pain is genuinely debilitating, and people in severe chronic pain deserve effective relief. The issue wasn't that pain was being taken seriously. The issue was what happened next. Medical organizations began advocating for better pain treatment with increasing urgency. Pain as the fifth vital sign became a movement, the idea being that pain should be assessed and addressed as routinely as blood pressure, temperature, pulse, or respiration. Healthcare facilities started implementing pain scales, asking patients to rate their pain from 0 to 10, and training staff to treat pain aggressively. This was compassionate medicine in theory. In practice, it created pressure on doctors to prescribe opioids more freely, because opioids were the most effective pain medications available, and patients were reporting high pain scores that needed to be reduced. Pharmaceutical companies, who have an extraordinary talent for sensing profit opportunities the way sharks sense blood in water, saw their moment. Purdue Pharma, maker of OxyContin, launched one of the most aggressive pharmaceutical marketing campaigns in history in the mid-1990s. They claimed that their extended-release oxycodone formulation was less addictive than traditional opioids because it released slowly over 12 hours, providing steady pain relief without the euphoric spikes that supposedly led to addiction. This claim was based on essentially no evidence. There were no long-term studies proving OxyContin was less addictive. There was no robust research comparing addiction rates between extended-release and immediate-release formulations. There was just marketing materials, sales pitches, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing doctors desperately want something to be true and therefore might not ask too many difficult questions about whether it actually is true. Purdue's sales representatives visited doctors' offices with the dedication of missionaries spreading a new gospel. They sponsored conferences, funded continuing education programs for physicians, distributed literature claiming that addiction was rare in patients taking opioids for legitimate pain. They cited a one-paragraph letter published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980 that mentioned only 4 cases of addiction among thousands of hospitalized patients given opioids. This letter became known as Porter and Jick after its authors, and it was cited repeatedly as evidence that prescription opioid addiction was extremely rare. What Purdue's sales reps didn't emphasize was that Porter and Jick were talking about hospitalized patients who received opioids for a few days under close medical supervision, not outpatients taking opioids at home for months or years without monitoring. The context was completely different, but the citation sounded scientific, and that was apparently good enough. Doctors, overwhelmed with patients in pain and trusting that pharmaceutical companies and medical journals wouldn't lie about something as serious as addiction risk, began prescribing OxyContin liberally. They prescribed it for back pain, dental procedures, sports injuries, post-surgical recovery, and basically any condition where someone reported significant pain. OxyContin was marketed as appropriate for moderate to severe pain, and the definition of moderate to severe became increasingly flexible. Prescriptions soared. Between 1999 and 2011, opioid prescriptions in the United States nearly tripled. America, with less than 5% of the world's population, was consuming over 80% of the world's oxycodone and almost all of its hydrocodone. We were exceptionally good at pain management, if by pain management you mean prescribing addictive substances at rates that would make Victorian doctors nervous. And people got addicted. A lot of people. A staggering number of people. People who'd never used illegal drugs, who had no history of substance abuse problems, who'd simply trusted their doctors when they said this medication was safe for pain management, found themselves physically dependent on opioids. The drugs worked for pain initially. They worked brilliantly. But tolerance developed quickly, the way it always does with opioids, because that's how opioid receptors function. Your brain adapts. You need higher doses to achieve the same pain relief. And when doctors refused to increase prescriptions or decided to taper patients off entirely, those patients who'd become dependent faced a choice between enduring withdrawal or finding another source. Some turned to doctor shopping, getting prescriptions from multiple physicians who didn't know about each other. Some turned to the black market, buying pills from dealers or through internet pharmacies that asked fewer questions than legitimate ones. And some discovered that heroin, which is just another opioid, was significantly cheaper and more accessible than prescription pills. A single OxyContin pill might cost $30–80 on the street. The equivalent dose of heroin might cost $5. The economic choice was straightforward if you were desperate enough. This was the first wave of the modern opioid crisis, prescription opioid addiction. The demographics were notable primarily because they were different from previous drug crises. These weren't inner-city minorities, the populations that drug enforcement had traditionally targeted. These were white, suburban, middle-class Americans, soccer moms, construction workers, veterans, retirees, people with good jobs and stable lives who'd taken medication exactly as prescribed and ended up addicted anyway. And suddenly, for the first time in decades, addiction was being discussed as a disease that deserved treatment rather than a crime that deserved punishment. This shift was long overdue and genuinely necessary, but it also revealed the deeply racist foundations of American drug policy with uncomfortable clarity. When crack cocaine devastated black communities in the 1980s, the response was mandatory minimum sentences, militarized policing, and mass incarceration. When prescription opioids affected white suburbs, the response was treatment programs, compassion, and discussions about addiction as a medical condition requiring medical intervention. Same disease, different demographics, completely different societal response. The racism wasn't subtle, it was the entire framework. By the 2010s, the crisis was impossible to ignore. Overdose deaths were climbing exponentially. Emergency rooms were overwhelmed. Families were being shattered by addiction, and the media was finally paying attention because the victims looked like them. States began investigating Purdue Pharma, and internal documents revealed during lawsuits showed that the company knew OxyContin was being abused, knew doctors were overprescribing it, and continued their aggressive marketing anyway. They had emails discussing which doctors were prescribing the most pills, internal concerns about addiction patterns, and decisions to continue marketing strategies that they knew were contributing to addiction. In 2007, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to federal charges of misleading regulators, doctors and patients about OxyContin's addiction risk. They paid $634 million in fines, which sounds like a lot until you realise they'd made billions in OxyContin sales and would continue making billions more. The fine was essentially a cost of doing business, and business continued until scrutiny became too intense to ignore. In response to mounting evidence of prescription opioid addiction, medical organisations and government agencies began tightening prescribing guidelines dramatically. The CDC issued recommendations limiting opioid prescriptions for chronic pain. States implemented prescription drug monitoring programs. Doctors, terrified of legal liability and regulatory consequences, cut back on opioid prescriptions sharply. Some stopped prescribing them entirely. This was necessary to prevent new addictions and absolutely correct from a public health standpoint. It was also catastrophic for people already dependent on prescription opioids. Patients who'd been taking prescribed opioids for years, who'd structured their lives around having access to medication that allowed them to function, were suddenly cut off. Their doctors refused to renew prescriptions. Pain management clinics closed. And these patients still had the same problem. They needed opioids to avoid withdrawal and to manage pain that hadn't gone anywhere just because prescribing guidelines changed. So they turned to heroin. This was the second wave of the modern opioid crisis, and it was directly caused by well-intentioned efforts to reduce prescription opioid use. The heroin flooding American streets in the 2010s was different from earlier versions. It was cheaper, more widely available, and significantly more potent. More importantly, it was increasingly cut with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that's approximately 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. Fentanyl was originally developed in the 1960s for end-of-life cancer pain, for patients experiencing agony so severe that nothing else worked. It was administered in carefully controlled hospital settings through patches or IV drips, with medical professionals monitoring dosing because the difference between an effective dose and a lethal dose is measured in micrograms. It was never, ever intended for street use. But drug dealers discovered it had several advantages from a business perspective. It's extremely potent, so a little goes a long way. It's easy to manufacture in clandestine labs. And it's incredibly easy to smuggle because a lethal dose is roughly the size of a few grains of salt. Drug dealers started cutting heroin with fentanyl to stretch their supply and increase potency. The problem was that fentanyl's strength makes it nearly impossible to mix evenly into heroin. You might have one bag of heroin with no fentanyl, and the next bag from the same batch might have enough fentanyl to kill someone. Users had no way to know what they were getting. Doses that would have been safe with pure heroin became lethal with fentanyl added. Experienced users who knew their tolerance, who'd been careful about dosing for years, died because they had no way to account for the fentanyl that had been added without their knowledge. Overdoses skyrocketed. Narcan, the opioid antagonist that reverses overdoses, became standard equipment for first responders and started being distributed to drug users and their families. EMTs who used to see 1 or 2 overdoses a month were suddenly responding to multiple overdoses per shift. The deaths weren't just users in stereotypical drug dens. They were people overdosing in parking lots, in public bathrooms, in their own homes with their families in the next room. The crisis had become impossible to hide or ignore. And then came the third wave, fentanyl itself, plus even more potent synthetic opioid analogues like cofentanil, which is used to tranquilize elephants and is approximately 100 times more potent than fentanyl. At this point, we're talking about substances so powerful that a dose invisible to the naked eye can kill an adult human. Drug enforcement officers started overdosing just from skin contact with fentanyl powder during raids. First responders had to carry multiple doses of Narcan because one dose wasn't enough to reverse fentanyl overdoses. By the late 2010s, the majority of opioid overdoses involved fentanyl. People weren't even looking for fentanyl. They thought they were buying heroin or Xanax or cocaine or prescription pills, and they died because everything was being cut with fentanyl. Dealers were pressing fentanyl into pill shapes that looked identical to legitimate pharmaceuticals. You could buy what you thought was a Percocet and end up with a fentanyl pill that would stop your breathing within minutes. The death toll has been staggering and continues to climb. Over 500,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses between 1999 and 2020. That's more than the entire population of Atlanta. It's more Americans than died in World War II. It's more than died from AIDS at the height of that epidemic. And the numbers continue rising year after year, despite increased awareness, despite treatment programs, despite Narcan distribution, despite everything we've tried. This crisis wasn't inevitable. It wasn't a natural disaster or an unavoidable tragedy. It was the result of specific choices made by specific people and institutions. Pharmaceutical companies chose to prioritize profit over safety, to market opioids aggressively while downplaying addiction risks they knew existed. Regulators chose to trust pharmaceutical company claims without demanding rigorous evidence. Doctors chose to trust marketing materials over centuries of evidence about opiate addiction. The medical system chose to treat pain scores as the primary metric, without considering long-term consequences of widespread opioid use. And policymakers chose to treat addiction as a criminal problem for decades, creating stigma and punishment that prevented people from seeking help until it was too late. Here's the cruelest irony at the heart of this entire story. We created the modern opioid crisis while trying to solve the original problem. Victorian doctors gave patients opium because pain was undertreated and people were suffering needlessly. Modern doctors gave patients OxyContin because pain was still undertreated and people were still suffering needlessly. Both times, we reached for opiates as the solution. Both times we underestimated or ignored the addiction risk. Both times we created massive public health crises. Both times we blamed the victims instead of examining the system that created the problem. The fundamental lesson that humanity has failed to learn for 3,000 years is this: opiates work too well. They don't just kill pain, they kill emotional suffering, anxiety, existential dread, the overwhelming weight of being alive in circumstances that feel unbearable. They make difficult lives feel manageable, and once your brain learns that this substance can do that there's a chemical solution to suffering, it will seek that chemical with the desperate focus usually reserved for food, water, and oxygen. This isn't a moral failing. This isn't weak character or poor choices. This is your brain, altered by exposure to substances that hijack the reward system evolution spent millions of years developing, demanding the chemicals it now believes it needs to survive. No amount of willpower, punishment, or shame can override that. The only things that work are time, medical support, compassion, and alternatives that give people reasons to stay alive besides the drug. We're finally starting to understand this, though the understanding has come far too late for the 500,000 people who've died. Treatment programs are expanding, though not fast enough and not equitably distributed. Harm reduction approaches are being tested in some communities. Needle exchanges that prevent HIV and hepatitis transmission. Supervised consumption sites where people can use drugs with medical supervision to prevent fatal overdoses. Medication-assisted treatment programs that use methadone or buprenorphine to manage withdrawal and cravings while people work on underlying issues. These approaches work. Cities that implement them see overdose deaths decline. HIV rates drop. and people gradually stabilizing and re-entering society. But they're politically controversial because they require accepting an uncomfortable truth. Some people aren't ready or able to quit using drugs, and keeping them alive and healthy while they're using is better than letting them die. This challenges the abstinence-only model that's dominated addiction treatment for decades, the model that says anything short of complete sobriety is failure. But that model has failed spectacularly, with relapse rates for forced abstinence approaching 90%. Maybe it's time to accept that keeping people alive is a worthwhile goal, even if they're still using drugs. Naloxone distribution has expanded dramatically. Police officers, firefighters, librarians and regular citizens are being trained to recognize overdoses and administer Narcan, the nasal spray form of naloxone that can reverse an opioid overdose in minutes. It's literally the difference between life and death, and it's being distributed widely in communities hit hardest by the crisis. Some people argue that naloxone enables drug use by removing consequences. This is like arguing that seatbelts enable reckless driving, or that fire extinguishers enable arson. It's confusing a harm reduction tool with moral endorsement, and it's a confusion that costs lives. We're also finally having honest conversations about pharmaceutical accountability. Purdue Pharma declared bankruptcy in 2019 as part of a settlement with states and families affected by OxyContin. The Sackler family, who owned Purdue and became billionaires from OxyContin sales, have had their name removed from museum wings and university buildings they previously donated to. It's a start, though it doesn't bring back the dead or undo the addictions. Other pharmaceutical companies are facing similar lawsuits and settlements. But we're still fighting against a century of bad policy, stigma that treats addiction as moral failure rather than medical condition, and the fundamental reality that opiates remain exactly what they've always been: extraordinarily effective medicine and extraordinarily dangerous drugs. And the line between those two things is thinner and more permeable than anyone wants to acknowledge. So here we are, thousands of years after the Sumerians discovered the joy plant, still trying to figure out how to live with it, still making remarkably similar mistakes, still losing people to a substance that was supposed to help them. The tools change. We've gone from raw opium resin to pharmaceutical fentanyl, but the pattern remains consistent. Human suffering leads to opioid use. Opioid use leads to dependency. Dependency leads to catastrophe, and we respond with some combination of punishment, moral outrage, and eventually far too late compassion and medical intervention. The story of opium is fundamentally the story of humanity's complicated relationship with suffering itself. We desperately want to suffer less. This is not unreasonable. Suffering is terrible. Pain is debilitating. Emotional anguish can make existence feel impossible, and we keep discovering over and over across millennia that the shortcuts we take to avoid suffering often create new suffering that's different and sometimes worse than what we started with. Maybe the lesson isn't that opiates are evil or that pain must be endured stoically without complaint. Maybe the lesson is simpler and harder. Relief has a cost, and we need to be honest about what we're willing to pay. We need to be honest about what pain relief is worth, what addiction treatment is worth, what keeping people alive is worth. These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're practical policy decisions that determine whether someone's child lives or dies, whether someone's parent gets treatment or imprisonment, whether someone in agony gets relief or is told to tough it out because doctors are afraid of creating addiction, those Victorian mothers dosing their babies with laudanum, those Civil War veterans injecting morphine, those chronic pain patients taking OxyContin exactly as prescribed, those desperate people buying what they hoped was heroin but turned out to be fentanyl, they were all looking for the same thing: a way to feel okay, a way to get through the day, a way to exist in a world that often feels designed to break you. This is one of the most fundamentally human desires there is. Opium promised relief. It delivered consistently and effectively for thousands of years. And then it asked for more than anyone was prepared to give. Your health, your freedom, your relationships, sometimes your life. The deal seemed reasonable at first. Pain relief in exchange for taking a medicine. But the terms changed without warning, the way contracts written in neurochemistry always do. Your brain adapted. The medicine became a need. The need became everything. We haven't figured out how to grant the wish for relief safely. We might never figure it out. The human brain isn't designed to be artificially flooded with opioids regularly. Evolution didn't prepare us for substances that can reach directly into our reward systems and press all the buttons simultaneously. We're trying to use Paleolithic brains with modern pharmaceuticals, and the mismatch creates problems that science alone can't solve. But we keep trying. Keep researching new approaches to pain management. Keep developing addiction treatments. Keep working on policies that might actually help instead of just punishing. Keep trying to find a balance between preventing addiction and treating pain, between personal freedom and public health, between compassion and enabling. It's messy, complicated, and there are no perfect solutions. But the alternative is giving up, and giving up means more death. The poppies are still growing. Right now, in fields across Afghanistan, Mexico, Tasmania, and Myanmar, poppies are swaying in the wind with the same innocent beauty they've had for thousands of years. Farmers are making careful cuts in the seed pods, collecting the milky sap, watching it darken into that sticky brown resin. Some of it will become legitimate medicine, providing essential pain relief in hospitals. Some of it will become heroin, sold on streets where people are desperate enough to risk death for temporary relief. The poppies don't know the difference and wouldn't care if they did. They're flowers. They're busy photosynthesizing and reproducing. They have no opinion on human policy debates. We're the ones who have to figure out what to do with them, how to use them wisely, how to help people in pain without creating new pain in the process. We're the ones who have to learn from history instead of repeating it endlessly, like a species with collective amnesia. We're the ones who have to decide whether we value punishment more than treatment, whether we care more about being right than being effective, whether we can muster the courage and compassion to acknowledge that addiction isn't a moral failure, but a medical condition that deserves medical solutions. 3,000 years of opium history suggest we're very bad at learning these lessons, but maybe, finally, after enough death and suffering and policy failure, we're starting to figure it out. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe we'll actually implement harm reduction widely. Maybe we'll fund treatment instead of incarceration. Maybe we'll develop non-addictive pain medications that actually work. Maybe we'll address the underlying conditions, poverty, trauma, hopelessness, chronic pain, that make people desperate enough to use drugs despite knowing the risks. Or maybe we'll keep making the same mistakes, keep choosing easy answers over effective ones, keep treating symptoms while ignoring causes. History suggests that's the more likely outcome, but hope persists anyway, stubborn and irrational, the way human hope always does. The poppies will keep growing regardless, beautiful, indifferent, waiting for the next cut. And we'll keep trying to figure out what to do with the gift they offer, this plant that brings relief and ruin in equal measure, this ancient medicine that's never stopped being dangerous no matter how sophisticated our formulations become. Maybe that's the real lesson, not that opiates are good or bad, medicine or poison, salvation or damnation, but that they're all of these things simultaneously, and which one they become depends entirely on context, dosage, desperation, and luck. The plant offers what it offers. What we do with that offer, how we regulate it, who we help and who we punish, how we balance relief against risk, those are human choices, and we're still learning how to make them wisely. One cut at a time, one policy at a time, one life at a time. The work continues, frustrating and necessary, while the poppies sway in distant fields, completely unconcerned with our struggles, just doing what evolution designed them to do, produce beautiful flowers and powerful alkaloids, and let the humans figure out the rest.